for us to use creative strategies to get back into the room. And in most cases, educational events, whether in-person events or virtual events, are the superpower to get you back into the room, because now your client-facing team members show up looking a lot more like consultants and teachers and subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. And when you do that well, and you're really dialed into the goals and challenges that are coming up in the buyer persona research, and each one of those goals is tackled one by one systematically in a separate event. Welcome to the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem and critical facilities and digital infrastructure, regardless of whether you're from a data center operator like a Colocation, hyperscale, or wholesale data center provider, or modular data center provider, or edge data center provider, or maybe your company does something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or perhaps you're in the construction, real estate, or investment segment within the data center ecosystem, or maybe your company does something related to some form of outsourced sales and marketing in and around the data center ecosystem. But regardless of what your company does, if you are responsible for client-facing communication, educating and building trust in marketing or sales or account management or product or channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the executive sponsor, but if you are looking to take your company's growth to the next level, you are for sure in the right place. If you're watching us live, let us know in the comments, what do you do in the data center industry and where are you joining us from? If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website. That's at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for this week? First up, we're going to look at how a colocation, cloud hosting, and managed IT services company can enter a new market. Next, we'll turn our attention to modular data center providers, and in particular, how modular data center providers can grow their client base. After that, we'll look at software, data center management software, and how a consultancy, how a consulting firm, a professional services firm specializing in data center management software can market and sell more effectively. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center infrastructure sales professional can get to decision makers. Then we'll look at how a data center building management system, BMS related company, can generate leads. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center energy management consulting firm can improve its target marketing. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address on an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you enjoy watching from. And without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question, which is, how does a colocation, cloud hosting, and managed IT services company enter a new market? How does a company that's principally in the business of colocation, cloud hosting, and managed IT services enter a new market segment? That is a fantastic question. And it's one that we see happening quite often, because we're really continuing to see a lot of convergence between colocation data center operators that historically were a lot more real estate focused, and colocation data centers that are a lot more now IT services focused. And I think the reason why we're seeing that is, as both of those categories, especially on the more entry level side of colocation, become increasingly commoditized, it becomes increasingly difficult to differentiate. A lot of companies with weak brands, or that don't have all the compliance to go after the marquee clients, the blue chip kind of clients, or that don't have enough power availability or low cost enough power to be super competitive. One of the ways that they can make their company stronger and overcome for some challenges that they have in being super competitive on just purely the colocation product is they can provide a lot of managed services. Some of the more basics they could potentially include within the colocation pricing. However, most would typically make these entities available as add-on services, either as productized services or custom quotes or all of the above. Now, a lot of colocation operators historically have shied away from being in the IT services business and instead have partnered with IT services firms in their local area with close proximity to their facilities, like managed service providers, MSPs, IT consultancies, technology integrators, value-added resellers. In some cases, these firms are so small that they're basically solo consultants, solo freelancers that do freelance work on behalf of clients in the data center. So there's some cases where the colocation operator simply refers their clients, refers their tenants to other IT services firms who can come in and do these projects. In some cases, the colocation firm is actually serving as an intermediary, and they're reselling these services with some markup to their clients. There's a lot of different potential arrangements, but we do see increasingly that a lot of colocation data centers want to actually be in the managed IT services business. However, the big line in the sand that most don't seem to want to cross is they're still only providing those IT services to hardware, to servers, to other switches and firewalls and network infrastructure storage that's physically in the data center. In other words, even though you could consider that they're a kind of managed service provider at that point, they're typically not sending their system engineers out to visit clients' offices or clients' facilities to do work out in the field. In those particular cases, usually they're partnering with other IT service providers who can provide that kind of service. So for some colo businesses, that's relatively new. For some colo businesses, they've made this decision like 10 years ago. Some of them will iterate a little more. The challenge with all of this is when we talk about like ideal clients and addressable market and segmentation and prioritized buyer personas, it's super, super common to find that colocation data center operators of all sizes, from single location, closely held, independently owned colocation data center operators, all the way through to the biggest of the big with dozens of facilities where they have to have this balancing act. Because in a lot of ways, the managed service providers, the IT services firms, the technology consultancies, in some cases, the master agents, they can be phenomenal channel partners for the colocation data center operators. So they essentially become an extension of your marketing and sales efforts, an extension of your services efforts. However, so much of the trusted business advisor model is built on trust. And it's incredibly important for you to think through what are the services that you're going to provide in-house and what are the services that you're going to recommend other service providers to your clients for. And the better job you can do with having clarity on that, the easier it is to convey that to your channel partners, the easier it is to convey to your end clients. And in most cases, when we're talking through your segmentation strategy and we look at your website pages for who you help, it's very, very common to find that the primary buyer persona and the secondary buyer persona are like end users. They could be IT executives, they could be engineers, they could be owners of tech startups, what have you. There's a bunch of different segmentation strategies, prioritization strategies, focuses that you could potentially go after depending on your facility's competitive advantages. However, it also is just as common to find a secondary or tertiary buyer persona for most colocation operators that are this channel partner. And I think it's really important to think about that, because your integrators, your IT services firms that you work with are going to be up against when it comes to digital infrastructure and finding the right colocation data center, they're going to have very, very different issues than the end clients that are top of mind going on in their world for their biggest goals and their biggest struggles. So if you're trying to come up with website copywriting, email marketing, social media posts, ads, in-person events, virtual events, whatever you're doing, the better job you can do with understanding what's going on in that segment's world and totally customize, totally personalize to what they're trying to get done the most, what's on their front burner, what right now, what their biggest challenges that they're trying to address and tackle, the better job you can do at that segment by segment, the more you are going to resonate. So when it comes to entering a new market, it's very common for the colocation, cloud hosting, and managed services company to all be one and the same. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of firms that are successful and just being in one or two of those businesses, but it is super, super common to find colocation operators who offer private cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, who offer direct connections to the big public cloud hyperscalers like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. And along the same lines, there's various degrees of being involved in those professional services. So when it comes to entering a new market, this sounds a lot like you already have a strong beachhead in an existing market. And the most common way that a colocation operator enters a new market is they buy or rent a facility in which they build one or more data halls, in which they build and commission a brand new data center space in that location. There's also a lot of smaller colocation operators who enter new markets by renting out space in someone else's facility. Let's say you're a smaller 1, 2, 3 location colocation data center that's doing a couple million of revenue, or your local currency equivalent, and maybe you have 10 or 15 clients. And most of your locations are all concentrated in the same region. The reason that puts a relatively low ceiling on the growth prospects of your business is it's very common as you get to more sophisticated clients that they're going to require, demand, whatever you want to call it, that you have not only multiple locations for redundancy in a single region, but have presence in other regions, in other parts of your country, in other parts of the world. Now, it can be really capital intensive to build colocation data centers all over the world. However, that said, there are a lot of wholesale colocation providers that will rent out part of their space to your company, like a sublease kind of arrangement. And when you do that, essentially now you have space that you can rent out, sign up your clients for, either just for that location or across multiple locations. That allows you to check off the box of having multiple locations. So those are the two big ways that you could potentially enter a new market. One is by being in the real estate business, acquiring land and site planning and going through all the zoning and approvals, which increasingly has become crazy expensive in so many different regions around the world because of not only the pre-planning stuff before the shovel hits the dirt for the first time, but even just utility power. So if this location you're acquiring has never been used as a data center before, and you're the pioneer, that's pretty capital intensive. That said, a lot of companies will do that and will do that successfully because they have a lot of talents on their team with deep expertise in the real estate side, the investment side of the data center ecosystem. So once that's in place, usually the most common thing that I tend to hear in that scenario is they're usually looking for an anchor tenant who's going to take a significant part of that space. I think different people have different ways of defining what percentage of the space is taken up by the anchor tenants, but I guess at the minimum you want 10%, 25% or something like that of your available square footage or square meters taken up by your marquee tenant. And assuming what people typically want is they usually want to use the brand reputation of that tenant as a kind of social proof to dangle in front of all of the smaller tenants that you're trying to close next, who aren't taking anywhere near 10 or 25% of your square footage, but all of a sudden are really impressed that you've managed to land Microsoft or AWS or Oracle or Rackspace or Alibaba or someone like that, Meta. So yeah, that's a lot of the ways that people tend to enter new markets. Now, again, if you're building from scratch, A lot more talent, a lot more capital needed to do that. A lot of smaller colocation operators get into new markets by renting space in someone else's facility. So that's in terms of provisioning and getting your racks and cabinets and your infrastructure set up. Now, what do you do to fill up that space? A lot of what you're most likely to do is look at in your current markets and your current beachhead where you've done best in the past. What do those clients have in common? How big or small are they? Where do they tend to be located? Are there certain industries where you do better than others? From there, you're developing your ideal client profile. And then within your client profile, you're adjusting that for the new geographic region. So let's say, I'll use a US-based example in this particular case. Let's say you have 2 locations in the greater New York City area, maybe one's in Manhattan and one's in Connecticut or one's in North Jersey or something like that. And you decide that you need a location in Northern California or Southern California. So say it's Southern California, you go and you rent space from someone else's facility in Los Angeles. So the most common playbook that typically people in the situation will use is they'll take what they know about their operations, marketing, sales, onboarding, servicing, provisioning, what's worked really, really well for their 2 or 3 locations or 1 or 2 locations in the New York metro area, and they'll try to replicate that magic. They'll try to replicate that product market fit in that additional market. So if you already have a good lead generation program going, if you already have a good lead nurturing program going, if you already have a good sales process going, if you already have productive channel partnerships going, essentially what you're looking to do is copy and paste and adjust for those geographic differences in that additional market. So let's say, for example, you've been wildly successful in filling up your current facility or facilities in the New York metro market by using account-based marketing, meaning that you've gone from having an ideal client profile to having a target account list, and you've done outbound prospecting by LinkedIn email and phone calls, as well as LinkedIn ads. So essentially, you take that same ideal client profile, instead of having Metro New York City, you have Metro Greater Los Angeles area, perhaps as far south as Orange County or something like that. And then you build your targeted outbound list the same way for cold prospecting, for running potential ads. And if you're having great success getting people directly to bottom of the funnel interactions, that's working for you, knock yourself out. Typically at this stage of the game, most of your prospects are not ready for sales conversations that could be a great fit, or not ready for sales conversations that early anymore. So typically what you're trying to do is to get an event registration, ideally an in-person event. Second best would be a virtual event like a webinar or something like that. So you're essentially segmenting that ideal client profile into your 2 or 3 core segments. And instead of inviting the ideal stakeholders, the right kind of job functions from those target companies that are in the New York City metro area, you're doing the exact same thing, except now you're looking for those similar kinds of job functions, those similar kinds of stakeholders on your target account list that's in the greater Los Angeles area. So that's typically how people would enter new markets. Now, pricing could be a little bit different. Competition could be a little different. So from a product management standpoint, yeah, you're going to do a little bit of scoping out with that. But in terms of just purely creating awareness and educating and building trust and lead generation and getting your sales process going, that's what I'd be thinking about for how a colocation, cloud hosting, and managed IT services company can enter new markets. If you've heard me talk about this topic before, you know I'm a huge fan of in-person events. So if you've had breakfast seminars or lunch and learns working really well in the conference room for your facility in Manhattan or North Jersey or Connecticut or wherever it is, use that same playbook. Do the exact same thing in your new location to the extent that you have the ability to do that, even with renting out someone else's space. If you have the ability to use their conference room, their classroom as part of that, or either paying by the hour, paying by the day, yeah, by all means, go for that. And presumably you're putting a salesperson, either part-time or full-time, in that area too, to be able to do tours. And I'm sure at the minimum you have a data center manager out there who can help with that as well, with getting that new market up and running. That's the simple use case. You're in the same country, you're just 3-4 time zones away. Where it gets more complicated is moving to different countries, where you potentially could have to localize your content and all your marketing and sales enablements, your website and everything for that particular country, for that particular language, different customs. But yeah, that's the general idea of what I'd be thinking about for how a cloud hosting and managed IT services company can enter a new market. Okay, what do we have up next? By the way, if you're getting good value from this week's show, Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to hit the like button to help spread the word, share the love. Let your colleagues, your coworkers know about this educational resource. Next question up is about modular data center providers, companies that build modular data centers that are looking to grow their client list. How can a modular data center provider grow their client base? So modular data centers first ended up on my radar screen in the early 2010s. At the time, Dell, IBM, I think Schneider was in that business as well. But the first time I actually walked through one and got to see it, I think was fall of 2016. I was out visiting Phoenix, speaking at a conference and visiting a couple of facilities. And at the time, a company called Base Layer, that was like a sister company of IO data centers that eventually became Iron Mountain. They had a factory out there, toured their facility. And at the time, one of the more innovative things going on at this big IO facility is that the modules were how they were building out the data hall. So instead of a traditional data center build out, the data hall was filled up pretty much with modular data centers, which a lot of times people think of modular data centers as exterior, like they're pulled up and they kind of look like a cargo container or like the RV equivalent of a data center. However, they don't necessarily need to always be outside of a building. They could, in this particular case, be inside of the building. And that speeds up, accelerates things tremendously, provides a crazy amount of flexibility with being able to do this. So for building your client base for that particular business model, what I see in the marketplace right now is 2 or 3 different categories of modular data center providers. There's ones that are competing on price, that are really, really aggressive on price and features and functionality, going after much more price sensitive buyers. And I sense that most of their approach is looking for small to mid-sized colocation operators that have a lot more price sensitive clients. And then there's ones where they're going all in on amenities and build quality and hitting all the credentials and exactly what like a hyperscaler would want to see in that particular context. And then there's middle ground on all of this, but essentially like a modular data center, they're typically built in factories and then transported to the sites. So your ability to sell into marketplaces really depends on where you can profitably, logistically handle transporting between your factory or factories where you're building these modular data centers and where your end clients ultimately need these modular data centers. The cool part with modular data centers is in the world we live in now, where there's just severe power shortages, grid power shortages, where you hear all the time about people having multi-year waits to get hooked up to the grid. The great part is modular data centers allow you to put the data center where there's grid power. You're not constrained by a piece of land and it's the predominant utility company in that local region with what they can do to get you hooked up to power. So it provides a lot of a flexibility for that. Historically, they've been used for short-term events like conferences or sporting events or something like that are taking place over a period of a couple of weeks, like the Olympics or something like that. Maybe a phenomenal example for that. They're sometimes used for disaster recovery purposes, where a company that had an enterprise data center that really wasn't doing all the best practices on business continuity and disaster recovery all of a sudden needs something new in the area, either replace or supplement while they're rebuilding. There's a lot of different use cases for that. But when it comes to growing the client base for a modular data center provider, a lot of it really depends on what kind of clients you're looking to attract. So this is where having really good alignment across your go-to-market team between products and engineering and marketing and sales is incredibly important, because what you decide to, the kind of clients that you decide that you want to target from a product management standpoint, from a business strategy standpoint, has enormous implications to how and where and when you'll end up being able to successfully run your brand building and your lead generation and your lead nurturing and your sales processes and everything. Generally, the lower end of the market, just like the lower end of the colocation market, will have a lower touch sales model, require that you have much more efficient lead generation and client acquisition, much more efficient unit economics, and will likely at some point favor working more with channel partners and having less direct sales force. Reason being is that a lot of companies with unit economics, lifetime value, cost of acquisition, sales cycle, and everything that struggle to operationalize that efficiently and raise enough capital to be able to run as fast as they'd like to, often find it very, very attractive to work with other companies that have direct connections to end users, and those other companies serve as an extension of their marketing and sales and servicing and commissioning in this particular case. So yeah, that's the lower end of the market. The mid-market and enterprise, it's kind of like being a wholesale data center provider, like a data center developer, except instead of developing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of square feet, you're developing a couple hundred square feet at a time and marketing and selling that. So because it's such a smaller deal and it's so much more specialized, modular building and go to market for a modular data center business is incredibly well suited for account-based marketing, account-based selling, meaning that as part of your working business plan, as part of your working idea for where you're going to get market penetration, you have a pretty good idea of what kind of clients these are going to be most attractive to. Is it end user? Is it enterprises? Is it operators? And if it's operators, what kind of operators? Is it predominantly edge providers? Is it predominantly colocation providers? Is it primarily hyperscale providers? And where do they tend to be located? Once you have clarity on the business model and where they're located and their company size, you should be able to sit down and manually build a target account list of a few dozen or a couple hundred. It's rarely a couple thousand. It could nationally or across multiple countries, it could be a couple thousand companies, but more than likely in most geographic markets, in mature, established, well-established data center markets, it's probably somewhere between a few dozen and a few hundred potential customers where you can reasonably ship it, deliver, onboard, commission, whatever you want to call it, hooking up to utilities, where you can reasonably do this profitably. And with that in mind, then the goal basically is very similar to what you would do with a colocation data center. Is from the target account list, you're figuring out who the 2, 3, 4 most important stakeholders that you want to build awareness with and educate and build trust with. The most important one you'll call your primary buyer persona. The second most important one you'll call your secondary buyer persona. Could have a tertiary, you could have 4 buyer personas. Each of those buyer personas, they'll get a page on your website, they'll get their own lead generation, they'll get their own videos. Probably if you're really scaling this, they'll get their own account executive specializing in that particular segment of your market. If you're big enough, you may have a whole team specializing in that particular segment of that market. And just like a colocation operator, the best way to build pipeline, the best way to grow this kind of business, grow this kind of client base, is FaceTime in an educational context, meaning that if you can get your ideal clients, and specifically those prioritized buyer personas within those ideal clients, to spend time learning from you and your subject matter experts, your client-facing team members, a lot of fantastic things can start to happen. So in order to do that well, it's not just about talking about how wonderful your modular data centers are. It's about understanding what's going on in each of those buyer personas' professional life. So understanding their biggest goals that they need to achieve professionally from the standpoint of data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. And besides those goals, like the kind of things that show up in their job descriptions, that show up in their objectives and key results, their OKRs, they potentially get performance reviews, potentially get bonuses based on. There's usually a lot of struggles too. There's usually a lot of things that are driving them nuts, big challenges. So when you understand those goals, when you understand those challenges, because you've done your homework and you can articulate those in their own words, again, because you've gotten the words out of their mouths, not just guessed, then it becomes a lot more straightforward to put together website copywriting, product marketing, sales enablement materials, email marketing, social posts, ads, and most of all, an event strategy for in-person events, and as well as potentially virtual events, that educates and builds trust with each of those prioritized segments, one segment at a time, by focusing on one goal, one challenge at a time. So when you have a colocation data center, it's usually a lot more straightforward to be able to host these events at your site, because you could have a classroom, could have a conference room, you at the minimum have a foyer. With modular data centers, it's a little trickier. Obviously, there's a factory that you have. You may have multiple factories, right? In the course of building those factories, I would for sure encourage you to make sure that you have 500 or 1,000 square feet or meters or whatever your equivalent is, to make sure you have a nice, well-equipped meeting room where you can invite your prospects, invite your future clients in to learn from your company's subject matter experts. And I would encourage you to go all in on this, because relative to other client acquisition channels, especially going to national and global conferences, your cost to host these events in your own facility is pretty close to free. And you literally, the space is already paid for. You already own your own building or are renting the space. You presumably already have a classroom or a conference room. So essentially, the cost of hosting these events is sending out some emails, making some phone calls. It's maybe a couple dozen or a couple hundred phone calls or emails to invite people to this event, having a place for them to RSVP. And then essentially most of your cost is just bringing in, if it's a breakfast seminar, bringing in a little bit of breakfast. If it's a lunch event, bringing in a little bit of lunch. You know, these are the kinds of things that for 15, 20 people, you'd be really hard pressed to spend more than a few $100s. I guess you could spend a few $1,000s and go crazy with lavish catering or something like that. But again, like, these are so cost effective and so ridiculously targeted relative to a lot of other big client acquisition investments that we'd see modular data center providers making. So I would encourage you, if you have the 3 or 4 different segments, tackle a different segment each week number of the month. So your primary buyer persona, the first week of the month on Wednesday mornings. Your secondary buyer persona, maybe you do a noon lunch and learn event on Tuesday afternoons, the second Tuesday of the month each month for your secondary. Do the third week of the month for your tertiary buyer persona. You get the idea. So 12 topics that are coming from your goals and challenges. Each one of them gets their own event. In a perfect world, you have deep enough subject matter expertise within your company that you have plenty of people that can come and give a 30, 45-minute talk about that particular topic. If for some reason there's some topics that come up where you don't have that internal expertise, that's fine as well. Look to your vendors, look to your channel partners, and bring in guest speakers, or bring in 2 or 3 guest speakers and moderate a panel or something like that. But the idea is they come into your facility, they have a little 15, 20 minutes of time for registration, having some lunch or some breakfast. They sit down, they learn some fantastically useful information to help them do their jobs better. It's ridiculously relevant because you made sure that you did your homework to know exactly what's going on in their world. They get enormous value out of that. You have like a 15, 20-minute Q&A session after that. Again, there's like 20, 30, 40 people in the room. So it's super casual. There's plenty of opportunities for you to get to know them and vice versa. In a perfect world, they're super receptive to bringing their colleagues or coworkers with them. So you're meeting the other members of the decision committee. And then afterwards, you take them on a tour. Again, if this is your factory, for sure, there's some great stuff that you'd want to take them around and show them in the same way you would do the exact same thing for a colocation data center. Now, this works well when your clients are within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your factory where you're building these modular data centers. If you don't have that proximity, then you want to partner with other companies that you likely already have a partnering relationship with already. If you have a colocation operator that has multiple facilities, locations across your country, across multiple countries or something like that, and they have space for you to transport one of your modular data centers for 2 weeks at a time or 3 or 4 weeks at a time, sitting in their parking lot, hooked up to utility power, then that's the perfect company. You go to the colocation operator and your marketing and sales team partners with their marketing and sales team. And you say, hey, I notice you folks have a nice little conference room or classroom. How about we do a co-marketed event every Wednesday morning for a couple of different segments? You invite your prospects and clients. We'll invite our prospects and clients. We'll have fantastic cross-pollination. And you're doing the exact same thing that you would have done in your own factory, except you're they're essentially parking your modular data center in their parking lot, hooked up to utility power for a couple of weeks or a couple of days at a time. And you're rotating through different segments, lather, rinse, and repeat. Now, what about the folks where it's not close enough for them to drive within a 30 or 60-minute radius for them to be able to attend and tour one of these facilities? Well, record these great presentations. have a videographer there and take the same content and essentially make those available with webinars. And the webinars also can be recorded, because we know whether it's in-person events or whether it's webinars, you always have an attendance rate that you're contending with. And you're never going to get 100% attendance rate unless it's mandatory employee only kind of employer kind of training. So given that there are always going to be more people that register than actually attend, and given that in nearly all instances, there's always multiple stakeholders within the same company that would benefit from the learning and development, professional development kind of resources that you're providing, there's always a fantastic use case for making these available on demand, so that your internal champion or whoever is attending these events has a resource to be able to pass around to the rest of their team. Again, the idea is that by you creating this fantastic professional development, learning and development kind of experience, is that you're helping to drive alignment proactively in the early and the middle stages of the journey. So you're with them throughout the full buyer's journey. And again, you'll learn a ton about what's going on in these accounts by doing this. They'll learn a ton from your internal subject matter experts, and you'll stack the decks majorly in terms of know, like, and trust, and getting and staying on the short list. And when you do this well enough and they keep coming back over and over again, you will essentially be knocking other companies out of the consideration set. Your competitors will drop from the short list because they're getting such an amazingly positive example of what it would be like to work with you as their modular data center provider of choice. So that's how I would approach go-to-market, sales and marketing strategy, growth plans for a modular data center that is looking to grow its client base. Okay, next question. By the way, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode of the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching. Next question up, what do we got? This one's about software. So before we were in the data center operator, data center provider segment of the data center ecosystem. With software, we're moving into the data center technology part of the data center ecosystem, at least in terms of management software. So how does a data center management software consulting firm market and sell? How does a consulting firm, how does a professional service firm that specializes in data center management software market and sell? That is a terrific question. So the challenge with being a consulting firm that markets and sells is you essentially are a intermediary. You're essentially a additional company that's between the clients and the ISV, the independent software vendor, the company that actually makes the management software. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just recognizing that because you don't make the software, you're not the developer of the software, that you have to work extra hard to build a brand independently of that particular company and differentiation independently of that particular company. This is a model that has worked exceptionally well for decades in the IT channel partner ecosystem, going back to the earliest days of Wintel and the earliest Windows and Intel in the 1980s and 1990s. And to this day, you still see tens of thousands of Microsoft channel partners, for example, that have been loyal resellers, VARs, integrators of Microsoft for literally decades, going back to the pre-Azure days. So yes, there are companies that are very successful in building their own brand autonomously, completely independent of the company from which most of their revenue is coming from. That said, if you're doing this today, it is exceptionally important to lean into being seen as experts. Because if you're just providing services without selling expertise, that's where you could potentially be commoditized. That's where you could potentially be backed into a corner and forced to compete on price. So what I would focus on is if your principals, if your consultants, if your partners have very deep expertise on this particular platform, it is incredibly important to let everyone on the planet, or at least everyone in your addressable market, know about that incredibly deep level of expertise. Historically, people have gotten really excited when they get validation from the software vendor themselves, either because they're channel partner of the year, or they're listed on a ranking list or a listicle or something like that. They win an award. And yeah, that certainly has its place. But what I would encourage you to do is to really, really deeply understand customer insights for your best clients better than the software vendor themselves. What does that mean? Well, the software vendor may sell to maybe a couple dozen different market segments that they could potentially be selling into. More than likely, as a consulting firm, as a consultancy, a professional services firm, your firm is likely considerably smaller. It may not be, but even if it's considerably larger, specializing your teams, specializing your talent by use case, by vertical, is incredibly powerful. So let's say for this particular platform, this particular data center management software platform, you have unique expertise in your ownership team, your management team, your senior consultants that give you a really strong competitive advantage when working with, say, financial services firms, manufacturing firms, and telecommunication firms. So much so that your three partners each essentially have a practice, a consulting practice where each of those just work with clients in financial services, manufacturing, and telecommunications. So I would encourage you to do for each of those practices is what you're likely already doing, but if you're not doing, you need to do like yesterday, is for sure you likely already have a page on your website for each of those segments under the who we help, how we can potentially help this kind of firm with this data center management software platform. In addition to having a separate page for each, I would encourage you to have a segmentation strategy for each, where you know who the 2 or 3 most important stakeholders are that you market and sell to when it comes to financial services, when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to telecommunications. And that would be largely attached to what's likely a standardized ideal client profile for the firm overall. It doesn't have to be, but it usually is. And that standardized ideal client profile for your firm as a whole, regardless of which of those 3 segments you're selling into, usually says, gee, based on the company whose platform we depend on and they're only supporting English, there's like 4 countries that we can sell into. So you list that in your ideal client profile. And when it comes to company size, we know that platform is a pretty good fit for a company that could be anywhere from, say, 50 employees to 10,000 employees. But what we've personally experienced is at 50 employees, they really can't afford our minimums. And on the upper end of the range, we also know that we're really outmatched when we get all the way to that extreme of 10,000. So even though the software vendor is really comfortable telling all of its channel partners to go for it with companies that have anywhere from 50 to 10,000 employees, we're going to say, no, for us, we actually are going to make our targeting 200 employees up to, say, 1,000 employees. So that's a much more narrow range. So in each of these 3 segments in your chosen geographic market, you essentially should be building out a target account list of the couple dozen or the couple hundred companies that are between 200 and 1,000 employees in that particular geographic market that are either in financial services, manufacturing, and telecommunications. So you'll end up with 3 target account lists that go to each of your 3 practice leaders, your lead consultants in your professional services firm for that. And then from there, they sub-segment those into the individual people in those accounts that you need to educate and build trust with. And then once you know who the 2 or 3 people are for each of those 3 segments are, you essentially will have sub-pages. So let's say for financial services, you are marketing the software to, on the smaller end, directly to a CTO or CIO. In the slightly upper end of the range, maybe you're selling to a vice president of infrastructure or something like that. And maybe a tertiary buyer persona is some kind of channel partner, a consultancy that's collaborating with you as the consultant or something like that. So you identify, you prioritize those, study the heck out of each of those to understand what's going on in their worlds, their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges. That forms your buyer persona document for each of those segments. And then from that buyer persona document, that'll help you fine tune your website copywriting and your sales enablement materials, your product marketing, your email marketing, your social posts, your content calendar, and most of all, your events calendar. And once you have prioritized which segment is the most profitable, which has the most economic impact, which is the second most profitable, perhaps there's a third most profitable segment, a tertiary buyer persona, then each of those should have its own educational events calendar, where one by one you take each of the goals, you take each of the challenges, and systematically, if you have 10 or 12, you have 5 or 6 goals, 5 or 6 challenges, so you end up with 10 or 12 topics. Those are the 10 or 12 topics to cover once a month for the next 10 or 12 months for the next year. And if you're in a position where your clients are located closely enough, they can come to these educational events in person, great. You host them in your conference room, in a classroom, or something similar to that. In the case of software, it's far more likely that you have a much more expansive ideal client profile, a much more expansive total addressable market. And because of that, I would lean more for a software business that your primary event strategy is probably virtual, leaning on webinars, and your repurposing of that goes to basically what I call tongue-in-cheek offline webinars. An offline webinar means you basically take the same content, the same slides, the same audience, the same landing page that you've used successfully in a virtual digital webinar setting, and you pick the 2, 3, 4 geographic markets with the highest concentration of prospects and clients, and you travel to that marketplace and you deliver that in person. Because it's in person, you probably, with webinars, usually you give yourself 4 to 8 weeks lead time. With in-person events, I'd probably give yourself a little more. So you have like 8 or 12 weeks lead time. You don't want to go that far out ahead of time, because if they register too far out for a free event, there's no skin in the game. So you may not necessarily get the attendance rate that you're looking for. But the basic idea is that if you have a good email marketing database and a good CRM, and you notice that there's huge pockets of prospects and clients for those financial services companies in these 2, 3, 4 regions, then yeah, those are the 2, 3, 4 regions that you should travel to once a year, twice a year, something like that, to be able to deliver this kind of content, to be able to deliver this event experience in person. Now, when it comes to software, your tendency more than likely is to jump right into demos or make most of the educational event about the demo. But I would caution you to make the demo maybe 15, 20%, about 15 or 20 minutes, 10, 15 minutes out of a 1-hour session, and make sure that most of the event, most of the session is about educating and building trust, about topics that are top of mind with that persona in the early and middle stages of the journey. Typically, your demo is for people that are at the decision stage. And for sure, if they're coming out to your webinar, if they're coming out to your event, yeah, a lot will want to see will want to see the product demoed in person. A lot will have some questions and things like that. But I would make sure that you start from a place of the what's in it for them kind of prioritization, being really, really customer-centric, client-centric with all this. If you've heard me before talk about a full funnel webinar strategy too, you'll know I'm also very partial to, in addition to having traditional educational webinars, also offering a group demo webinar on a pretty regular basis that substitutes or augments what you do in one-on-one demos. In other words, a lot of account executives for a firm like this would focus on trying to get as many cold strangers and as many warm leads to book one-on-one demos, feeling that that's the first domino to fall in the sales process. Recognize that a significant portion of your prospects and clients are curious about this platform, of which presumably you have very, very deep expertise on, but aren't ready to put themselves through a prospecting, qualification, and sales process, but they do want to learn more. So as long as they can remain semi-anonymous, and it's not totally anonymous because they're registering for your webinar, they will come and they'll learn. And many times they'll be willing to bring their boss or their coworkers along with them as well, because they're all curious. And the analogy that I often tell people to think of is, imagine that you have a booth at a major data center conference. And every 20 minutes in that booth, you have your head of product or your CTO or your whatever it is doing a demo with a wireless mic. And you typically have you have seats in the booth, 10, 20 seats where people can sit down and watch, or you have a handful of people that will gather around and stand in front of the screen for 5, 10, 15 minutes and watch this demo and ask some questions. However, what you also frequently notice is that there will be some people that are gathering in the back of the booth, on the edge of the carpeting, perhaps off of the carpeting into the aisle. Those are the same kids, the same students that when they were in school especially in like a big college lecture hall environment, always sat in the last row. Why did they sit in the last row? Because they didn't want to get called on. If they could have been invisible, if they could have had a cloak of invisibility, they would have done that as well. That's essentially the use case for the ideal client on your target account list who would love to attend a group demo, but does not want to be in your sales process a moment earlier before they absolutely positively have to. And in a self-driven journey where 83% of the research comparing options decision making now happens without you in the room, it is incredibly important to allow the prospects, your future clients, to feel like they're still in control. So those are some of the things that I would be thinking about for a data center management software consultancy to be marketing and selling. In addition to those webinars, in addition to the in-person events, in addition to those 2 different kinds of webinars, I'd also give a lot of thought to having an interview-based podcast where you interview some of your best clients, you interview some other subject matter experts to talk specifically about not the product necessarily, not necessarily about the management platform, the data center management software itself. You could certainly talk about that a little bit, but I would talk more about the bigger picture business issues, those big goals and challenges that come up for each of those prioritized personas in each of those 3 segments, the 2 or 3 different segments within financial services, within manufacturing, within telecommunications. So again, that would argue for likely having 3 different podcasts, a podcast specifically for the intersection of that platform and financial services, the intersection of that software platform and manufacturing, the intersection of that software platform and telecommunications. And obviously the host of that podcast should be your senior partner, your co-founder, whatever it is, of the consulting firm that specializes in that particular vertical. So those are some of the big considerations that I take into account when it comes to building the go-to-market, the sales and marketing strategy for a data center management software consultancy, management software consulting firm, and how to market and sell, given a couple of different segments and personas even within those segments, to really, really, truly differentiate and get out of the vendor box and avoid marginalizing your firm by living within the shadows of the vendor of the software provider that you do this for, and instead really carve out your own deep brand completely independently of their brand. So again, that's what I would think about for how a data center management software consultancy can market and sell. We're going to take a real quick break now for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest go-to-market sales and marketing challenges faced within data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are watching our weekly Q&A live stream, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments and we will add that to the consideration queue. So what's up next? What's the next question that we're going to tackle this week? This one has to do with, it could be technology related, it could be facilities related. This particular business model oftentimes actually spans both data center technologies and data center facilities. And the question, the challenge is, how does a data center infrastructure sales professional get to decision makers? How does a sales professional that works for a data center infrastructure company get to decision makers? So the first thing that we want to address with this is infrastructure could be somewhat vague. There's technology infrastructure And then a lot of times there's power, there's utility related infrastructure. So we need to know, does your company get involved in both of these areas, or do you specialize in just one of those areas? Once you get that out of the way, then in order for us to sharpen our focus with getting to decision makers, we'll dive into either documenting or refining, confirming our ideal client profile. And our ideal client profile needs to be based on historically where our company has done best. How will we discover that? Well, there certainly should be some clues about that sitting in your CRM, in your customer relationship management system. But it may even be more straightforward than that. If your website is designed like most, you may have testimonials, reviews, case studies, logos all over your website talking about the kinds of clients who get a lot of value from working with your firm. And in that particular case, what we're essentially doing, regardless of where we get this data from, is we're looking to find what they have in common. Where do they tend to be located? Are they located all within a same state or province or region or country or a specific continent? Or can you truly sell data center infrastructure globally? So geography is the first thing that we need to settle when it comes to getting to decision makers. We need to know where these decision makers are located. Second, what company size do your best clients tend to be from? What do they have in common? So if you look at, let's say, for example, we're looking at a dozen representative clients and we have their number of total employees, their headcount, the same kind of information that you'd glean most of the time from going to each of these companies' LinkedIn company pages. And you can either see the enumerated headcount based on the number of employees that are attached to that page, or their stated headcount based on what they fill out when they build or modify that LinkedIn company page. But either one is fine. Essentially, what we're looking for is just a rough barometer of what the company size is for that particular company. So we take all of these data points together, and we could take a range and say that, okay, so we know they're located within these two countries, and we know that their company size could be anywhere from, say, 200 employees up to 5,000 employees. And that makes sense as a sales professional. That makes sense as a sales leader. That makes sense as a founder who's done in these conversations, because much below that 200 employees, they probably can't afford our minimums. And above 1,000 employees, 10,000 employees, 5,000 employees, whatever we decide the ceiling to be, they're going to have requirements that we just can't deliver on today. So we're going to be self-aware. We're going to set that range. And then, so we now have the geographic part of the ideal client profile down. We have the company size part. And then the third area to think about when it comes to data center infrastructure is specific industries, niches, verticals, business models, where we're better than others, where we're a better fit than others. And this is more of an issue with technology infrastructure as opposed to facilities infrastructure. With technology infrastructure in particular, it's quite common that when you have a geographic region plus a particular industry, there's certain certifications or accreditations or compliance requirements that pop up that are unique to that kind of business, that kind of industry, and a particular geographic location. And if you have those, fantastic. You should be prioritizing those in your outbound prospecting, in your go-to-market, in your sales and marketing strategy. If there's certain industries or business models where there's accreditation, compliance, certification requirements that you do not have, you should also be listing that in your ideal client profile, because it's the opposite scenario. We want to make sure that we're not wasting resources chasing after prospects, nurturing, putting companies into our pipeline, our sales process, where we know we're not going to be successful with them because they're going to have a requirement that we just can't, a credentialing requirement that we just can't deliver on right now. So those exclusions could be like negative not kind of filters in a prospecting tool like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or something like that. They'd be exclusions on an ads platform like LinkedIn Campaign Manager. You'd have drop-down lists that have both for the inclusions and exclusions showing up in your lead gen forms. So when somebody clicks the drop-down list on the exclusions, they're put into a filter in your CRM to deprioritize and make sure that your sales team isn't spending a lot of resources on those folks going forward because they're not a good fit. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways. And obviously the inclusions that are prioritized usually get their own pages on their site, on your website. They usually get their own lead generation funnels, their own premium content offers, perhaps their own blog, their own podcast, certainly their own events, and in many cases, their own teams, their own sales teams, their own AEs. It's increasingly common that we see in data center operators and data center technology and data center facilities throughout a lot of the data center ecosystem. We see company leadership deciding to specialize sales teams by size and or by industry. So say, for example, you're really good at providing this infrastructure to education, governments, and hospitality. So you would potentially hire account executives with deep experience in education and specific industry experience in government and specific industry and experience in hospitality. Is it possible you find one person that's a jack of all, master of none? Yeah, that's probably not the best approach. So if you really want to be super competitive and have that account executive or that sales team be able to provide deep consulting expertise to their prospects and clients and be able to open doors that others are not able to open, being able to hire someone that has several years or several decades of experience deep in government, deep in education, deep in hospitality at the intersection of data centers and information technology and digital infrastructure is a real strong flex, is a really strong superpower. That alone does wonders to help you get closer to decision makers. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because a lot of people think they just need to get to the decision maker. The reality is, in a self-driven buyer's journey, in the world we live in now, where nearly all of the journey is happening without you in the room, it's increasingly important for us to use creative strategies to get back into the room. And in most cases, educational events, whether in-person events or virtual events, are the superpower to get you back into the room, because now your client-facing team members show up looking a lot more like consultants and teachers and subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. And when you do that well, and you're really dialed into the goals and challenges that are coming up in the buyer persona research, and each one of those goals is tackled one by one systematically in a separate event with a subject matter expert that can provide a ton of value for 30 or 45 minutes or whatever it is around that particular topic, it tends to be really, really powerful when someone registers for that event, for them to get back an email that says, "Hi, Susan, it's so great to see that you're registered for our upcoming breakfast seminar on digital infrastructure best practices for school district technology directors." But well, we know when it comes to data center infrastructure, it takes a village. Typically, there's people involved from infrastructure, operations, cybersecurity, finance. So with that in mind, who else from your team would benefit from attending? Just simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two on why this matters, and we look forward to helping your team navigate these challenges. And you'd be shocked how well that works. That simple email marketing automation that you have been able to do for 20 years, one, it's shocking how few of the companies you compete against are doing that, when it literally takes like 15 or 30 minutes to set that up when you're setting up your event registration platform. But it's shocking how well it works, even if only 10 or 20% of the people that you make this request to say, "Oh, yeah, it's a pretty good idea." And you'll know it's working because you start to see multiple people from that school district or that government agency or that hotel or restaurant chain or whatever it is with the segment that you're marketing to. You see multiple people from the same company registering together and attending together. And when they attend together, the magic really starts to happen, because you're proactively driving alignment in the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey and the formative stages of their research and decision-making process, where they're learning, where you're inserting yourself into their learning and development and professional development initiatives in a way that can really, really introduce them to your methodologies, your best practices, your case studies, your criteria that you use for them to figure out like what's the best way to make these critical decisions around data center infrastructure. And when you do this well, you start to notice that by event number 2, event number 3, event number 4, you start to see more and more people from that same company coming, because word gets around that they love coming to your lunch and learns or your breakfast seminars because they're learning a ton and they get access to these super smart people from your team and your channel partners. And by the time you have 3, 4, 5 people from the same company, one of them takes them aside and says, "Hey, we love coming to these. Any chance you can come in and present at our company offsite next month? We'd love to have you come in and present in front of our entire IT organization and our board of education, whatever it is, about this particular topic." You're like, whoa, that would be awesome. So the magic things really can happen with driving pipeline, deepening these relationships, and educating and building trust when you lead with education. But in order to lead with education, you have to know what's going on in their world. You need to be a lot more customer centric, client centric than you likely are today. And that starts with doing your customer insight research, doing your buyer persona research, and understanding what's going on in their own world at the intersection of data center infrastructure, what's a leading indicator that they're going to need to make a decision on data center infrastructure in the coming weeks and in the coming months. The whole idea is we need to get in early and we need to get in often. Think about like 25 touch points that someone goes through between complete stranger and purchase decision. We want surface area in as many of those 25 touch points, those many 28, those 30 touch points as possible. And the best way to get that surface area is events and email marketing. Obviously, even if you're doing events once a month, every 4 weeks or something like that, you still need a way to stay in touch in between, because you don't know when this goes from being back burner to being emergency front burner. And the better job you can do of continually reminding them that you're there to deliver strong consultative educational value as opposed to there to selling them something, the more that you get the trust built up to the point where not only are they confiding with you about unique information that they're not telling anyone else, but they trust you and they know that your company is stacked with deep expertise about data center infrastructure. And because of that, even in competitive bidding situations, as is clearly almost always going to be the case with public schools, public colleges, and government, you will still get the inside track on exactly what they're looking for. And this is where you can start to even have dramatically impact what goes in the RFP, the request for proposal, or the RFQ, the request for quote, with things that your company is uniquely positioned to be able to do that they just can't get elsewhere. So getting to decision makers, remember, in most of these deals, it's rarely a decision maker anymore. The decision makers have gotten so risk averse that in nearly all cases, they're going to tell you, even if you manage to get a meeting with the decision maker, they're going to tell you to go back and talk with their team. And if you can drive alignment and get everyone on the same page with their team, then yeah, they'll move ahead. So winning over multiple stakeholders is a huge reason why people invest in account-based marketing, account-based selling. And it's so fantastically powerful to combine that with educational events where multiple stakeholders from that same company, from that same account, from the decision committee are all attending and learning together across their team, potentially across more than one team from the company, to proactively drive alignment. Because that's a lot of what being an account executive looks like going forward, being a sales professional looks like going forward, is in many ways, it's like you're being a project manager for your enterprise clients' internal champions and helping to support them as they need to drive buy-in, as they need to drive alignment across the rest of their team and other stakeholders on other teams throughout that company that have a major role in deciding what that company is ultimately going to do with their data center infrastructure going forward. And a lot of this as well is really helped by your sales professionals upskilling to the point where they're strong enough technically that they look like they could almost be a technology consultant rather than just an account executive. They don't need to be the most senior technology consultant within your company, but at least like a solid intermediate level. And that's usually done with training and certifications, upskilling, a commitment to professional development. Some people in that role set up small data center computer labs in their home office, typically supported by their employers, giving them second generation equipment, leftover equipment to allow them to have this kind of environment. In a lot of cases, employers provide financial budget for them to be able to take some courses and certifications as long as you're doing this on your own time. In other words, a common thing that we hear about all over across the board with both clients and people on the podcast is they want sales professionals that are willing to take the initiative to learn on their nights and weekends, but they will help support that not only by giving them leftover equipment from the company to use for that purpose, and they'll also give them budget for tuition reimbursement. One of the CEOs of a major data center operator that I had on the podcast a few months back said one of their biggest frustrations is they make these programs, they make the budget available, and they have to twist people's arms to use it. So like they're willing to give their employees a couple $1,000s a year for this stuff, and nobody's using it, which is a shame, because if you really want to be able to have these great, deep subject matter expert kind of conversations with your prospects and clients, you need to look a lot more like one of their peers, one of their coworkers, even a more junior intermediate level coworker, and a lot less like someone that's just trying to get a deal over the finish line to be able to make quota. So that's how a data center infrastructure sales professional should be thinking about getting to more of the right decision makers. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure you help us spread the word, share the love by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on. Okay, what's up next? This question is about the facilities management part of the data center ecosystem, and specifically how a data center building management BMS provider can generate leads, how a data center building management systems provider can generate leads, whether it's building management, building monitoring, it's all facilities related. So the way I would first approach this is to get really clear about where you have been most successful in the past. The companies that are going all in on facilities usually have strong preferences for working with certain kinds of end users, certain kinds of enterprise data centers, and certain kinds of data center operators. It's possible that they build a platform that has the same value for colocation and hyperscale and edge and modular and enterprises, but it's far more likely, especially if you're resource constrained, that there's certain use cases, certain business models, certain facility sizes, certain locations that are just a much better fit than others. So digging into where you've had the greatest success, I want to see you really dial in your ideal client profile and your target account list before we talk about lead generation. So specifically get really aware of the regions where you're offering this platform. Can you truly offer globally? And I've had these conversations with leaders of software companies, and a lot of pushback and say, yeah, like English is the universal language in a lot of these countries, and most IT professionals in big enough countries are bilingual or multilingual. So we actually do have pretty good footprint in a lot of these countries, even if we don't localize. But yeah, in addition, even if your platform gets some adoption in some of these regions in English, where English isn't the first language, you're almost certainly still going to need marketing resources and sales resources and services and support resources that are bilingual or multilingual to be able to get deeper relationships with those companies. Otherwise, your company is just going to be really vulnerable to someone that is closer to those clients because of cultural affinity, cultural proximity, better localization, whatever you want to call that. So that's going to help you dial in geographically where your platform can get the best reach, the best penetration, the best market share. And then there's sizes. And just like I said a few moments ago, in the same way, when it comes to this particular category, especially within facility management, you likely have had success and struggles with some common kinds of clients, whether it's certain kinds of enterprise data centers where you've been more successful and others where you've struggled. And the same thing within operators. It'd be relatively unusual to find that across the board, no matter what the business model is, whether it's colocation, hyperscale, wholesale data centers, edge data centers, modular data centers, it'd be very, very unusual for you to be fantastic at all of the above. And if you're fantastic at all the above, you're still almost certainly going to need to segment your sales team to be able to be relevant and compete aggressively in each of those relatively different kinds of business models and how they would use a BMS. So with that in mind, so you get dialed in on the location, you get dialed in onto the sizes, who's big enough to afford your minimums, not so large that they're going to have all these crazy custom requests that you can't accommodate, and you get dialed into the business models that are a good fit. From there, before you're generating leads, you're likely manually building a list of target accounts to prioritize that align with that ideal client profile. And depending on whether you're selling retail colocation operators, whether you're selling enterprise end users, or just a couple handfuls of hyperscalers, will depend on how many companies are on your target account list. It could be anywhere from a couple dozen to potentially a couple thousand on a national or global basis. Then within those companies, who historically have been the best internal champions for you? What has the biggest economic impact? Who's had the second most important economic impact? Who's like kind of a tertiary stakeholder with all this? So not only identify, but prioritize, and then starting with the primary and working your way down to secondary and tertiary if it applies. Build out buyer personas, very well-researched customer insight buyer personas for each of those segments, so you know the goals and challenges for each person that has interest in what your BMS does for them. So maybe facilities manager is your primary. In a smaller data center, maybe it's a data center manager who'd be your secondary, and maybe there's a channel partner, like an integrator or consultancy firm or some kind of service provider, that's your tertiary, your third stakeholder. And then within each of these, what are their 5 or 6 biggest goals? What are their 5 or 6 biggest challenges? And it's super important that you get those goals and challenges in their own words. And in most cases, what they're saying may not be immediate direct line of sight to your BMS, but is instead the leading indicator that they're going to be in the market for a BMS in the next couple of weeks or the next couple of months. And then that research drives your copywriting for each separate page, for each of those segments on your website. It drives your email marketing strategy, your social posts, what you do with ads, and certainly what you do with your events, both in-person events and virtual events and webinars. And with all of these, for sure, you want to record them, make them available on demand for people that should have attended but weren't able to, especially additional stakeholders from the same companies of people that did attend. And you could potentially repurpose those educational events into shorter videos, clips, and shorts. You could repurpose them into image-based content like LinkedIn documents and slide decks. You could repurpose them into short text posts. You could repurpose them into podcasts. There's a lot of ways that you can repurpose the same kind of educational events. But at the end of the day, if you want to generate fantastic early stage leads, middle stage leads, late stage leads, we need to understand who they are and the journey they go through, the active research process they go through in between when they first identify a goal or challenge that they're struggling with, and ultimately when they make a decision to invest, to purchase, license a BMS for their particular company. And the better job you do with understanding who they are, what's going on in the world, and what they care about, the more likely it is that you will earn your way in early and often. And early and often is the unlock with all of this, is we need to know the leading indicators. So we're in as early as possible. If we only get in at the end, in many ways, it's usually too late. It's kind of like missing the first 3/4 of the basketball game or the football match or something like that. And you show up at the end and it's already a blowout. Your team is already buried. It's too far to actually recover from that. Or in the case of baseball, you imagine you only arrive at the stadium at the 8th inning and your team is already losing by 15 runs. Like the likelihood of rallying back from that, next to nothing. The same thing, like, you can talk to people that are historians of NFL Super Bowl and how many times when a company has been down by X amount of points going into the last 5 minutes of the fourth quarter, has there been a reversal in the game? It happens, but it's not a likely scenario. So we need you in early to establish the framework, to be the one that's doing all the education and trust building, and ideally education and trust building with multiple stakeholders from that same company. So you're proactively driving alignment in those formative stages so you can impact the criteria that they use when it comes to anything and everything that's directly related to BMS. So this is where you'd look internally to your subject matter experts that have deep expertise, not only on the platform, but in facilities and engineering and all the related disciplines that are adjacent to what your core product does. And if you have those internal subject matter experts and they're great speakers, fantastic. If you don't have that expertise internally, then this is where your consultants, your channel partners, your contractors come in as guest speakers at your events. You could potentially bring in clients or channel partners and moderate panels. This is what I call conference grade content, where you may be the conference host or organizer or producer because you're hosting your own events in your own facilities, but I would use the same basic process that you would use if you're trying to get a session onto the editorial side of a major data center conference, meaning that several months ahead of time, you come up with a working title and an abstract of what someone is going to learn from attending that session and who the ideal clients are. Your thought leadership team, a representative group of internal and perhaps some advisory council kinds of people, look at that topic and they say, like, that looks pretty good. I think facility managers at enterprise data centers would get a ton out of attending that particular session. So thumbs up, go for it. So thumbs up, go for it, meaning that your marketing team, they start to build out the landing page, they start to build out the promotion plan. And 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time, they start to drive awareness and drive registrations for that. Around that same time, your thought leadership team says, we want to make sure that we deliver fantastic value to people that attend. So show us the slides, show us the deck. We want to make sure that it's not too self-promotional, that it's not too salesy, that it's really delivering on the promise. So you put your slides together, you get feedback from the committee. They're like, wow, this is amazing. People are going to learn a ton from being there. They're going to wish they pushed their coworkers and their boss to attend even more so. There's going to be for sure an element of FOMO for the people that weren't in the room. So like, yeah, we're really excited about that. So that's check and balance number 2. Check and balance number 3. Your conference room seats 20 people. Your classroom seats 30 or 40 people. I want to know that if most of those seats or all of those seats are filled up when you start, I want to make sure that by the end, that most of those people are still sitting there and incredibly engaged. I don't want to see that they left. I don't want to see that they bored and they're checking out mentally on Zoom, zoning out on their phone and everything. I want to see that they're learning a ton, that they're watching intently, that they're taking notes, that they're participating, that you can tell from their body language, they're really, really getting a lot of value from attending this. And obviously, check and balance number 4 is your surveys. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend or colleague? What can we do better at the next one? What can we improve on? What other topics do you think we should cover? Would you like a demo? Really, really straightforward kind of stuff to evaluate providing enough value, conference grade content. So essentially the goal with all of this, whether it's webinars, whether it's in-person events, for in-person events, they come, they register, they have some breakfast or lunch, they chat a little bit. You have your formal part of the program, there's a Q&A, and then there's a demo. For a webinar, they're not really typically arriving early, and it's tough to send the bagels and the coffee and the pizza through the Zoom, through the webinar software, but it's the same basic idea. They arrive, there's a couple minutes of introduction and warm-up. You talk about the same 30, 45 minutes of core topic that you would have if you were in person. You open it up for Q&A, and you give a little demo and perhaps a special offer, a call to action at the end for the people that attended the webinar or attended the event live. So that alone will generate fantastic leads. It is very highly likely to get multiple decision committee members from the same company attending together, learning together, and having successful forward momentum on most of these deals. So that's the overall approach that I would use, is educating and building trust so that your prospects and your clients see your internal subject matter experts as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with building management, building monitoring, BMS for your particular company in a particular region of a particular company size with certain kinds of business models. So it becomes obvious that when it comes to that particular category, that you've totally stacked the decks in your company's favor as much as possible. So that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, which is, how does a data center energy management consulting firm improve its target marketing? How does a data center energy management consulting firm improve its target marketing? So we're dealing with the facility side of the data center ecosystem, where power and energy are pretty closely related. Liquid cooling, evaporative cooling, traditional HVAC is all directly related. Commissioning, decommissioning, physical security, environmental monitoring, all of these are very closely related. Facilities management, very closely related. So what can we do in that context? If your firm is a consulting firm, professional services firm specializing in energy management, to improve how you go about your target marketing. A lot of it really depends on how big your firm is and how big or small your prospects are. At the end of the day, the biggest challenge for most professional services firms in this space is differentiation, standing out in very crowded marketplaces and being able to have a strong enough brand halo that people are coming to you largely pre-sold. If you have to do a ton of outbound prospecting and running these really heavy, expensive sales processes, that usually tells us that there's a lot of work to do with building a stronger company brand, with building a stronger professional brand. And historically, where most people have invested the most aggressively for this kind of firm is they've gone all in on traditional PR, trying to get media outlets to say nice things about them, and the other side of PR, trying to get events producers to let them be on stage presenting at conferences in an educational context, as opposed to a pay-to-play advertorial sponsor booth kind of context. That's historically where most people have concentrated a lot of their attention. In some cases, they have done guest blogging, writing articles for traditional trade publications, blogs. The more modern version of that, they've tried to get on other people's podcasts as guests. They've tried to be speakers at other people's webinar panels and educational events. But it's largely most companies in professional services around most of the data center ecosystem, and data center energy as part of data center facilities is really no exception to this, have relied a lot on intermediaries and gatekeepers to decide whether they get access to an audience or whether they don't. The good news, there's good news and the bad news. The good news is you don't necessarily need the gatekeepers anymore. You can build your own media and events company, even as a tiny consultancy that can do a lot of amazing brand building for you without needing to pay off, without needing to suck up to, without needing to go through all the political nonsense of getting access to these audiences through trade publications or through industry conferences. That said, because it's never been less expensive, there's never been a smaller moat to being in on being your own media and events company, there is a ton of competition for people's attention. What does that mean? It's not just about providing value. It's providing value for very specific kinds of people in very specific kinds of companies in specific geographic regions of roughly similar kinds of company size. What do I mean by that? It's a lot more difficult for an individual consultant or an individual consulting firm to achieve topical expertise in data center energy management on a global basis, especially as a smaller firm. But if you start to narrow that down and have deep energy management expertise in a particular country or in a particular city or in a particular region, that becomes a lot more manageable. And when you're specializing in just a particular country or just a particular city, all of a sudden now it becomes much, much easier for you to keep up with all the industry changes, all the government regulatory changes, all the financial, all the investment implications that are directly or indirectly related to energy management that you would need to keep up with to truly be a subject matter expert in the space. Along the same lines, it allows you to have a much more finely tuned ideal client profile, a much more finely tuned target account list, a much more finely tuned set of personas and educational events, and a very, very tightly niched podcast, breakfast seminar series, webinar series. You could write a book. There's a whole different way of ebooks, state of research reports. There's a lot of different ways to approach this, but it becomes a lot easier to improve your target marketing when you're a lot more precision tight in your targeting in the first place. And again, because energy management is so closely tied to geography, it's far more likely that most people in this kind of business model would anchor their ideal client profile and anchor their targeting to a specific city or a group of cities or a particular country or a particular state or something like that, that really, really allows you to go all in on understanding who the personas are, where they hang out online and offline. For sure, building some presence at hyper-specific kinds of events where there's a strong ideal client profile match with that event's demographics. But I wouldn't go to super broad events. I would say cherry pick the events where there's a very high match rate between your ideal client profile and their demographics, and then use a lot of your other resources and budget to build your own events, to build your own media where you know exactly who's being invited, you know exactly who's attended. You don't have to compete to get. A very common thing that we see happening among a lot of conferences now is more speakers are better than less speakers. And as a result, because of logistical limitations, we see increasingly a lot more panels. The good part with a panel is you don't need a big deck. The content is way easier. It's just 5, 10 questions, 3 or 4 people talking about it. But if you have 4 people sharing a 40-minute panel, do the math. Each person gets about 10 minutes of time at that 3-day conference. And not only are you getting 10 minutes of time, that's one of 3 or 4 concurrent sessions going on. So when you divide, assuming the audience was dispersed evenly between those 3 or 4 breakout sessions, so you get 25% of those 1,000 people at the conference in the room for you. Okay, there's 250 people watching the 4 of you. So you do the math on this and you're slicing and you're slicing and you're slicing. And the good part is the conference organizer did all the heavy lifting to get the people in the room. The question is, are they the right people? Do their stated demographics and their media kit align up reasonably well with your ICP? Or is it needle in a haystack where there's a big loss factor, where there's a huge percentage of attendees that don't line up with people that could be good clients? When you're hosting your own events, you have the opposite scenario. You know your ideal client profile, you know your target personas, you know what's top of mind for them when it comes to energy management. And it becomes far easier for you to say, okay, there's 4 weeks in the month. We have 3 different personas that we really care about. Week 1 of every month, we're going to do a 12-part series, 1 part each month, for data center facilities managers. And week 2 of every month, we're going to do a 10 or 12-part series for data center energy managers. And the 3rd week of the month, we're going to do a multi-part, 10-part series for community stakeholders like elected officials, utility companies, regulators, community activists, anyone that we consider a community stakeholder. So with that in mind, it becomes far easier to know exactly who's being invited. It knows exactly who's attended, and you know exactly how much time you're going to have to be able to educate and build trust with that audience. And you're not competing for attention with 3 other panelists and 3 other simultaneous things that are going on. Because when you look at 4 different concurrent sessions and 4 panels, you're one of 16 speakers. Plus, if you add the moderators in there, it's even smaller than that. So the question is, do you want to be a minuscule fish in a much larger pond? Or do you want to be the one who's constructing the pond, who gets to decide how the pond is stocked, how the pond is located, what the rules are, who's allowed to visit and come swimming in the pond? Probably not the best analogy, but hopefully you get the basic idea, is that you can have so much bigger of an impact on shaping the beliefs of how your primary and your secondary and your tertiary stakeholders navigate their choices with data center energy management when you're the one who does the research to decide what topics to cover in the first place. You decide how they're going to be prioritized. You decide the time of the month, the day of the week, the time of the day you're scheduling them. You decide how much time is allocated to them, who the speakers are, all of the above. And most of all, you're the one who's controlling the invitations so that you're largely focusing on ideal clients that are on your target account list. So that alone can do wonders with improving the precision of your outbound prospecting. That's emails, cold emails, LinkedIn messages, potentially using ads, like in something like LinkedIn Campaign Manager, potentially could even use direct mail. Overall, the quality and the quantity of your efforts and the return on investment that you get from this kind of event-centric campaign will come down to how good your customer insight research is, how good your database is, the quality and the quantity of your database and the relationship that you have with that database, and how good your experts are at being able to communicate your passion and best practices around what your most important stakeholders should be thinking about when it comes to anything and everything that's directly related to data center energy management. So That's my overall guidance. That's the basic idea that I would use to think about how a data center energy management consulting firm, consultancy, professional services firm can improve its target marketing. So that is the final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you like to watch on or listen on. If you want to make sure that you get invited to upcoming educational events like this or learn about new educational resources, make sure that you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, just make sure to send me a connect request and include in the cover message that you were watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. So we are so glad that you were able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. We wish you great success in growing your business. We look forward to hearing your success stories, and we'll see you back next week. Take care now. Enjoy the rest of your week.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.